probably more scientists now, not 400, but maybe 1,000 people, to discuss what have we learned in the last 4 months, what are the big knowledge gaps that we now have much more information on, what are the remaining big topics that we need to work towards. So we hope that we take stock, and then we look forward again to the next 6 months on what are the priorities we need to work on. Now, specifically on the vaccines, I think everybody is interested in knowing about vaccines. What we did at that time, early January, February, was okay, scientists are going to be coming up with vaccine candidates. What is it going to take, for something in a lab to actually get to becoming an injection that people can receive? And there are many steps, many steps. It's not easy. Vaccine development normally takes 10 to 20 years. So here we're talking about developing a vaccine in 12 to 18 months. But we have to be sure each step of the way that we establish that this vaccine actually works, which we call it efficacy, which means that it protects against infection, and safety. These are the two properties of the vaccine. It should be safe in the sense you do not want a vaccine to cause more problems than what it's supposed to protect against. And so you have to go through these different phases of testing, starting from the laboratory, from cell cultures. Then you go into animals, mice, and some larger animals like monkeys. Then you go into humans in a small number of people, what we call a phase 1 trial, where about 20 or 30 people or 50 at the most are given this injection. Sometimes different doses are tried, and you look at them very carefully over the first few weeks to see what happens, both in terms of an immune response, because you want a good immune response to the virus, but also any side effects. Then you go to a phase 2, which is usually several hundred people. Again, you're looking at the immune response, you're looking at safety, you start looking a little bit at efficacy, and then you do a phase 3 trial, which is usually thousands and thousands of people, where you have two groups. One group gets the vaccine, the other group gets usually some other vaccine as a standard or a placebo injection, and then you wait and watch over a few months for people to develop COVID through natural exposure. And then you see how many people developed in the vaccine group, how many developed it in the placebo or the standard group, and also you are looking at side effects. Then you come to a conclusion on whether the vaccine is having protection and also safe, efficacious and safe. And then there are criteria by which you judge that. And that's where policy bodies like the SAGE on immunization will come in, because they will then look at all of this information and say, yes, this vaccine passes the test and can be recommended. And sometimes there are caveats. You cannot give some vaccine to elderly because it doesn't have a good response. Some vaccines cannot or should not be used in children till they are properly tested in children. So pregnancy is another one where we have to be very careful and make sure the vaccine doesn't cause damage to the fetus. So these are all the different aspects which need to be looked at. And so, as I said, normally this takes minimum of a few years, 4 or 5 years, but because we're in the middle of a pandemic, we are trying to compress this timeline, but at the same time not compromising on any of the scientific principles that I mentioned.
Thank you very much, Dr. Soumya. And a lot of our viewers are already asking, even though you explained the whole process that we need to go through to develop a safe and effective vaccine, they're still asking, when can we expect a vaccine against COVID? And at the moment we have over 200,000 candidate vaccines, right? 200. So do we know if any of these is in advanced process at the moment of a trial?
Yes, and it's true, everyone is waiting for a vaccine, because it's clear that a vaccine would be the best way out of this pandemic. If you can vaccinate enough people, let's say 50-60% of people become immune, the virus can stop spreading from one person to another. Now, you can get immunity through natural infection, but we've seen now in many countries where there's been a lot of infection that even at the end of a big outbreak, you have only 5 to 10% of the population with antibodies. So it's clear now that through natural infection, it's going to take a very, very long time to get natural herd immunity. So we need a vaccine. Now, what's the soonest we can get? as I said, we're hoping through doing everything in parallel, instead of doing one step after another, which is the normal process of vaccine development, we try to do overlapping. You're already planning the manufacturing while you're still doing the clinical testing. You're overlapping phase 1 and 2, phase 2 and 3. But the minimum it takes about 12 months, 12 to 18 months. The good thing is that some groups started working in January as soon as the genetic sequence of this virus became public. And so in March, we actually had the first vaccine candidate being tested in human beings, the phase 1 test. Now there are 2 vaccines that are currently in the later stages of testing, phase 2, phase 3. So we are expecting some results by October, November, December of this year. Now we cannot predict at this stage if either of those 2 vaccines is going to meet those standards that I talked about. But if we are hopeful and optimistic, yes, we could have the results at the end of the year, and we could also have some doses available. Now, how many million doses are going to be available? We cannot say. But the good thing is that we have another 8 or 10 candidates which are getting into human trials, and again, which will be in large scale human trials by the end of this year. So we're going to have 10, 12 candidates entering or completing some part of human trials, and therefore we can be very hopeful that in 2021 that we will have at least 1, if not more, candidates which are shown to be safe and effective. And you remember that it's not enough to show safe and effective, then you have to manufacture hundreds of millions of doses. So the other thing that WHO is working on is this developing a allocation framework, because we don't want to be in a situation where there are some doses of vaccine but that they're not available to everyone, that they're just available to a few people in a few countries. So this is where the global solidarity comes in, and our member states are discussing, how do we make a fair and equitable allocation, so that, let's say you have 50 million doses to begin with, who are the people who need it the most? It shouldn't be limited by country, but it should be, is it the most vulnerable, the frontline workers that we see are getting infected? Is it the elderly, people above 60 or 65? We need to have a consensus on that, so that we agree to share the virus, the vaccine that's available. The virus has been shared by all around the world. So now we need to share the vaccine also in a way that we protect the most vulnerable. And as we go into 2021, 22, we'll have hundreds of millions, and many companies are saying they will manufacture billions of doses. Then it becomes easier to distribute it more fairly.
But WHO as well launched an initiative to work with countries and partners to ensure access to vaccine once it's developed, right?
Yes.
Could you tell us more how we are doing and collaborating with countries in this initiative?
So there are 2 initiatives which are linked but a little different. One, what we call the COVID Technology Access Platform, which is an initiative that was launched by the Director General and the President of Costa Rica and about 35 other heads of state about 2 weeks ago, to basically ask countries and research funders and companies to deposit their technology into this access pool, which means that you then make it available to the public as a public good. And some people have described, for example, a people's vaccine, which means you develop it, but then you donate the technology, you donate the intellectual property so that everyone can use it, many companies can use it. The other initiative that we're leading and we're working really hard on is called the ACT Accelerator. So that's it's ACT stands for Access to COVID Technologies again, Accelerator. It's basically, how do we bring everyone together, private sector, public sector, funders, multilateral agencies, the UN, and scientists, to develop these tools, diagnostics, drugs, and vaccines for COVID, and do it in an accelerated time frame as soon as possible. And it starts with access. So it's not just about the research and the development, but it's how do you get access to people? How do you make sure that we can deploy it in all countries? So that accelerator is really a wonderful way of all partners coming together to see how do we do this. And a part of that is also how you invest in these tools. You do public pooling, you do risk pooling. So if all countries invest in a whole range of vaccines, then there's a better chance for every country to have a winning candidate. It's like a race. If you bet on one horse and that horse doesn't win, then you're left with nothing. But if you're able to pool your resources and bet on 6 horses, one of those 6 has a much better chance of winning. And this is where I think the public needs to understand, politicians, countries need to really come together and say, how do we, this is a global problem, so it has to be a global solution. And in this case, a national solution will not work for very long.
Thank you, Dr. Sumia. We are receiving some very interesting questions, and here is the first one from Carolyn Rayleigh, saying New Zealand doesn't have any more cases of infection, I believe. So why are you still thinking the rest of the world needs a vaccination?
That's an excellent question. And I think New Zealand and a few other countries have been able to show that by applying the standard and well-tested public health measures, that they've actually been able to cut the transmission down to practically zero. And as I said, there are other countries who've shown this is possible. There's Vietnam, there's South Korea, there's Germany, there's Taiwan. There are countries and areas that have shown that this is possible. Within larger countries also, some areas have shown it's possible, but many places are struggling. And so I think while this question raises the important point that what do we have now? We have diagnostics, we know how to do contact tracing, we know how to do syndromic surveillance, identify people who have the symptoms, to be able to isolate them. We need to find their contacts and quarantine them, and the public needs to follow the things that have been shown to work, maintaining physical distance, wearing a mask when you go out, covering your face, and ensuring that you're doing your hand washing and respiratory etiquette, not coughing and sneezing in public, staying home if you're sick. If everyone followed all of this, I think we could bring down infection rates in many countries. But I think in the long term, New Zealand opens up its borders, it will have infection coming in because it's spread all over the world now, and people cannot remain in isolation. And therefore you need a vaccine so that we can go back and start the economies up again as quickly as possible.
Thank you, Dr. Sumia. Here is another question related to vaccine development, and our viewer is saying that my country has started for a clinical test phase 1. The vaccine is imported from another country. What do you think about that? Can it work? Because we know the strain from every country is different. The mutation of COVID-19 is very high.
That's another excellent question. Luckily for us, the mutations that have been observed, and all viruses mutate, they change, so that's expected. But the mutations have not been shown to be in those regions of the virus, the spike protein, the receptor binding domain, that are going to alter the efficacy of a vaccine so far. So viruses keep on changing, and we have to keep an eye on that. But the other interesting point that this question has raised is it okay to do a vaccine trial in one country and then have it applicable to all countries? Based on the science now, yes, we think so, because the virus may be slightly different, but it's not so different that the vaccine will not work. But it's also good to have vaccine trials in many different countries, because you have different populations, different genetics, different risk factors, and so it is a good, and WHO would very much like to see the candidates that are being developed now being tested in many countries. Like we're doing the solidarity trial for medicines. The other advantage of that is that we have seen this epidemic up and down in different parts of the world, right? So you have a Europe wave that subsides, and you have the North American wave, you have a Latin American, a South Asian. So if you have trials happening in different parts of the world, it's much more likely that you will have places where there's still active transmission of the infection going on. So you can answer the questions, you can finish the trials faster if you are set up in different parts of the world, because if you're doing it in one country and the infection is controlled, like we mentioned New Zealand, but also China, for example, you won't have enough infection. So the trial will not be able to be successful because you can't compare the two groups that we talked about earlier. So that's another reason, and I think it's a very good point that's been brought up, to have these global trials.
Thank you, Dr. Sumia. Here's another question. You touched base on that already, but maybe to explain more. The question is coming from LinkedIn, and thank you. How will the vaccine be tailored for the population where a large range of biological factors might interfere with the effectiveness of the vaccine between individuals? For example, different health conditions, age, different lifestyles, environment exposure.
Yes, excellent questions. So this is why you need these phase 3 trials, which are large. I said they're usually in tens of thousands of people, so that you get a mix of all of these factors you mentioned. Age, sex, other diseases, conditions. Age is extremely important because old age and young have different immune responses. The elderly don't respond as well to certain kinds of vaccines. And for this COVID, we have a range of different vaccine platforms. So there are some which are traditionally being used in many different vaccines, like we know that inactivated viruses, where you kill a whole virus and use it, as a very old method of vaccination. Then you have whole but attenuated viruses. They're still living, but they have less virulence. Then you have protein. You just take a part of the viral protein and you use that with an adjuvant. But now we have new platforms which are DNA and RNA viruses, which have never been used in people before. They've been developed for other diseases but never used on a wider scale. So here it's exciting because you have the advantages of some platforms which can be manufactured in large amounts and used like the RNA vaccines. But on the other hand, we don't know how it will actually turn out when we test. So it's exactly to have this kind of information in different populations, different risk groups, different age groups, male, female, etc., that we need to do these large phase 3 trials. And it's a big undertaking. It's not very simple. And here again, that's why we need collaboration. We need countries to come forward to take part in trials. You need companies to come forward and say, we offer our vaccine for testing in many places. And you need well-trained teams. And you also need the local communities to be engaged and understand. So it's all of you, it's the communities that should ask questions, that should participate in the decision making. And every country that wants to do clinical trials, this is the time to start doing those preparations, having those dialogues with people who will eventually be the volunteers, with the regulatory agencies in the countries, with the ethics committees, with the doctors who are going to be leading these trials. So we need all of this to happen now before we start having these big trials in the second half of this year.
Thank you, Dr. Sumia. Here's the next question coming from Sailesh Bastola. What technological research are going on for faster and more accurate virus detection?
That's again, it's an excellent point. And as everyone knows, right now for the virus detection, you need to take a specimen from the respiratory tract through a nasopharyngeal swab, and then you need to take it away to the lab in a medium, and then you extract the RNA of the virus and then you detect it. It needs a pretty sophisticated lab environment and trained people and machines. What we would like is a diagnostic test that could be rapid, easy to do. Any health worker can do it, low risk, so that you're not coughing and things like that onto the person, and you can get the result in half an hour. So what we call a rapid detection test. We have this for other diseases like other respiratory infections. Even for influenza, there's a rapid test. You go to the doctor, they take a swab, you wait, half an hour later you have a test. For streptococcal sore throat, we have the same thing. That's what we need, where scientists are working on a rapid antigen test which could be used on a respiratory, and if it can be self-done by a person at home, that would be even easier, because then you don't go into a health center and expose yourself or expose others. So that's one area of work, and we don't have one yet, but hopefully we will. The other one is, can we use saliva or can we use an oral swab, instead of putting the swab to the back of the throat. So again, people could do it themselves and drop it off at a testing center. And then in the test center itself, there are innovations like pooled testing. If you have a shortage of kits and you want to test more people in the community, you could pool 5 or 10 samples and then do the PCR test. And if it's positive, then you have to test individual samples. But if it's negative, all those 10 people were negative. So you've actually saved on on many kits, because we know that shortage of kits in many countries is affecting how many tests they can do. But so diagnostics is an extremely important area of research.
Thank you, Dr. Soumya. Let's talk a little bit about treatment. We know that at the moment there is no treatment for COVID-19, but WHO launched an international solidarity trial to help finding an effective treatment. So how does this trial work?
So before I talk about the trial, let me just say that while there's no specific treatment for the virus, we know what we have to do to treat people. And again, you see countries who've done it well have very low case fatality rates. So it's not, we don't need to give up that we don't have a treatment. What we need to do is to diagnose people early, which means again you have to do more of case finding, you have to go out in the community and test people, everyone who has symptoms. Finding people early and keeping them under observation is a very good way of reducing mortality, because then you know how they're progressing, and if there's any sign that their oxygen levels are dropping or that they are becoming breathless, you know they need medical care. Oxygen is extremely important. So all health facilities that look after COVID patients must ensure that there's oxygen. There's a lot we've learned about the nursing of these people and how to look after them, when to use ventilation, when not to use ventilation, what are the other supportive drugs that seem to be helping. So there's all this clinical management, which again we're putting out guidelines on and updating them. But then of course we would like to have a drug that works specifically against this virus. Antiviral drug discovery is again not a very easy task. So what we started off by doing, what scientists started off by doing, is looking at existing drugs which are already used for other diseases and then seeing if we can repurpose them. So quickly do lab tests to see whether the existing drugs are active against this virus in the lab, and then take those into phase 3 clinical trials, because you've already established the safety of that drug in for some other disease. It's being used in human beings. So it's called repurposing. So the Solidarity trial that the WHO started and many other trials around the world were basically testing these other drugs. So we've got, in our trial, we've got lopinavir ritonavir, which is used for HIV treatment. We've got hydroxychloroquine, which of course is used for malaria, but also for other autoimmune diseases. We've got a drug called interferon. Interferons are also used as stimulants of the immune system. They've been used against MERS, another coronavirus, for example. Then we've got remdesivir. This is a drug that's not been widely used. It was developed and tested for Ebola, and it was shown to have antiviral effect against SARS-CoV-2. So these are the 4 drugs that we are testing within the Solidarity trial, and other trials are also using the same drugs. And the idea was again to do it in a large number of patients around the world and to use this drug, these drugs against a standard of care, which is your control against which you will compare. And currently we have about 4,000 patients enrolled in about 18 countries, in over 450 hospitals. So this is a huge collaboration across the world. Every continent is involved. Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, in the Middle East, in Europe. And so we will have ultimately, hopefully, good answers on whether these work or don't work. Now, because these are repurposed drugs, they were not specifically developed for this virus, there's a chance that they may not work, but it's worth testing them and trying them. And meanwhile, of course, scientists are coming up with more, we're keeping an eye, so we keep on updating our landscape document to see what's new. And the next set of drugs which go into Solidarity may be monoclonal antibodies, it could be other drugs that people are finding are effective. So we've established the platform now, and all of these doctors across the world are excited and wanting to continue this type of exercise. So once we finish testing one lot of drugs, we can take another set.
Dr. Soumya, how can countries join the trial, and can individuals volunteer to be part of a trial if their country is part of it as well?
So the way it works is that WHO, of course, put out a call, and we received, in fact, over 100 countries we received expressions of interest. So what we do is then we follow up with the Ministry of Health. We have to sign an agreement that we work together, and the Ministry of Health must agree to co-sponsor the trial. Then they actually appoint one leading doctor in the country to be the coordinator, and that doctor then identifies the hospitals where COVID patients are being